Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Heather ONeill to our At Home with Literati series this evening in conversation with Mona Awad. Just a quick overview of webinars for our attendees. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep that chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase When We Lost Our Heads from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A feature is accessible to you on your toolbar. You can use that to submit any questions you might have this evening. I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And live transcription is available on the toolbar as well using the CC icon. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also subscribe to be kept up to date with all of our events when they become available on our channel at a later date. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Heather ONeill is a novelist, poet, short story writer, screenwriter, and essayist. Her internationally acclaimed books include The Lonely Hearts Hotel and The Girl Who Was Saturday Night. Her debut novel, Lullabies for Little Criminals, was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction. ONeill lives in Montreal with her daughter. And Mona Awad is the author of Bunny, named a Best Book of 2019 by Time, Vogue, and the New York Public Library, who's a finalist for the New England Book Award and a Goodreads Choice for Award for Best Horror. It's currently in development for film with Jenny Connor and New Regency Productions. Awad's first novel, 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl, was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and winner of the Colorado Book Award. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Time, McSweeney's Plowshares, and elsewhere. She teaches in the creative writing program at Syracuse University. Please join me in welcoming Heather ONeill and Mona Awad into your living rooms.
Hey, Heather, it's so great to see you.
Thanks nice to see you too, Mona.
Yeah, it's so awesome. I wish we were in person, but this is the next best thing. So I'm totally honored to be in conversation with you tonight. I've been a fan of Heather ONeill's work for a very long time, so it's really such an honor. And this book is just incredible. This When We Lost Our Heads is so magical, so sharp, so imaginative, and so immersive. I just loved it, and you're all gonna love it. So I'm really excited to talk about it, and I thought we'd start with Heather maybe giving us a little taste of it.
Okay, I'm just gonna read the first page. It's the first teeny little chapter. It starts off the book, and it's called The Duel. In a labyrinth constructed out of a rose bush in the Golden Mile neighborhood of Montreal, two little girls were standing back to back with pistols pointed up towards their chins. They began to count out loud together, taking 15 paces each. Mary Antoine and Sadie Arnett had met in the park on Mount Royal behind their houses when they were little girls of 12 years old. It was 1873. The two of them seemed to have been born with the same amount of thick hair on their heads, except that Sadie had dark brown hair and Marie's was blonde. Sadie had large, dark eyes that were almost black, cheekbones that were already high, and lips so dark red they looked as though they had makeup on them. Marie had blue eyes and a complexion that looked porcelain and a mouth that was the lightest pink. It was almost as though they were two dolls that were being marketed to girls, one fair, one dark. That day, Marie had on a white tailored jacket with blue embroidery down the sides. It fell just below her knees, revealing her white stockings and pretty blue leather shoes. Sadie had on a burgundy hat with a black ruffle. It was about the size of a cupcake. It was propped on her head uselessly, but at least it didn't take away from the impression her black velvet coat with burgundy buttons made. She had small black shoes with black bows on the toes. The pistols had roses engraved on the handles. A maid looked down from the second-story window. She was buttoning up her chemise and whistling. From her perspective, she could see into the labyrinth and its clearing in the middle. At first, she doubted what she was actually seeing. It didn't seem possible at all. There's always something surreal about children embarking on something dangerous. They are oblivious to the danger. They act as though they are about to defy all the laws of physics. For a moment, the adult is suspended in the realm of childhood disbelief. The maid broke the spell. She ran down the stairs with only her drawers on and her chemise half done. Her red hair flew behind her as though she were carrying a torch. She ran out through the labyrinth screaming. Finally, she arrived there. She stood in the middle and opened her mouth to tell the girls to stop. At the precise moment, they both spun around and fired their guns at each other. And as the two bullets hit the maid and she fell to the ground, the words alerting the girls to their idiocy were forever silenced.
I love it. It's so good. Was that the first theme that you wrote?
Not really. I had like a different scenes with them, and I had this scene that for some reason I just knew I wanted them to have a duel. So I had been just working on that scene, and then it occurred to me, oh, what happens if I just put it at the beginning? And that would kind of set the tone to, we just know that, and then it goes back to introduce the girls and how they met, and we would know that they're going towards some murder and mayhem. And this is how the book is going to be. There's little girls, but they're going to be doing extraordinarily strange and inappropriate things throughout the novel.
That's definitely one of the great pleasures of reading it, for sure, is watching them at work. So just orienting us in this world, where are we and who are we with, just to kind of situate us before we get into conversation.
Okay, so this book is set in the Victorian period, and it's in Montreal, and there's basically two separate worlds going on in the book. One is the Golden Mile, which is where Marie and Sadie are both from, and it's very upper class. Extraordinary wealth was up there at the time, and there were all these incredible mansions that were being built on the top of the hill to display this newfound like wealth, with all the immigrants coming in who are working in factories, and just they started making incredible loads of money. Mm-hmm. And then underneath it is what, so that one in real life, that's called the Golden Square Mile. And the Squalid Mile, which I gave a name because it didn't really have a name in the same way, and it's all been lost to history because it wasn't built with the same architecture. It was just built quickly. So, but that's a Squalid Mile, and I kind of researched, and I had to really look for details of what it was even like to describe the sort of filth of it, the wonderful, like the way they had little oyster shacks and brothels and factories and little factory girls running around everywhere. So it's two kind of worlds, and we see the ambitions of the two girls on the Golden Mile sort of going through, and then how those ambitions affect this underworld and how it slowly starts to come up the hill. Yeah,
that's awesome. And of course, yeah, the relationship between Marie and Sadie is just so amazing. The book makes several allusions to the French Revolution, and is very concerned, as you were describing, with class and with revolution. And the most blatant nods are, of course, in the names. The main character is Marie Antoine, and another is Mary Robespierre, and there's cake eating, and of course there's the title, which is so evocative of the French Revolution. But it's not merely a transposition to a Canadian setting. So I'm curious, why did you look to that French moment to provide a kind of historical shadow for the story?
I had always, since I was very young, been really fascinated with the French Revolution and those figures and how they had kind of gone to intellectual texts and tried to reframe the world in class according to them. But I was always kind of curious, like how I could write about the French Revolution, but it never really spoke to me directly as a woman, because women were sort of, even though they participated in the revolution, like, storming Versailles and whatnot, they were just left out of the ends of the revolution. And right afterwards, women's rights actually went backwards, and it was less free for them. So I was interested in that kind of dialogue. But then I was like, what if I transposed it to the Victorian times, which was just at the beginning of the women's right movement and right before the first wave of feminism.
Right.
And so I could kind of have that. Whereas in the French Revolution, the lower class were trying to assert that they were people and had personhood. And then when the first wave of feminism happened, then women were trying to assert that they were people also.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that Victorian period kind of gives you a little bit more latitude, which is good. Your style is so rich and unique and so ornate, like one of Mary Robespierre's cakes. So for those of you who read it, you'll be delighted by that. And yet it's always razor sharp and direct, which is what I love. It's such a beautiful balance. So I'm curious, how deliberate are you in crafting the style? Does it just come on the page naturally? And what are some of your style inspirations?
Style inspirations. You mean literature or just every kind of?
No, anything. I know you're inspired by lots of different things. Yeah.
It's funny. I think it just kind of, that's my voice, and it's so you kind of work on your voice since you begin writing as like, I don't know, when you're like 18 or 19, but it's so it's, there's a kind of childlike thing to it, but I have such a dark sensibility. It's odd because it just kind of, it reflects my own kind of personal interest, because I do like delightful things. Like I'm always intrigued by Alice in Wonderland, and I was so interested in children's literature and the way figures and fairy tales. And at the same time, I'm just have always been so drawn to macabre stuff and really dark tales of murder and kind of in like perverse sexuality. So it kind of, I don't understand exactly why these two things kind of came together to create a style. So it has this, I always have this lightness with an incredible dark edge. So I always mention sometimes Edward Gorey, because he does a similar thing with those, with children who are just in these absolutely, and they're adorable and they're dressed in little suits and the perfect bows, but they're always being faced with these totally macabre situations where they're murdered. And I always kind of, there's something about that just excites me, that dynamic.
Oh yeah, no, I love it. What was kind of the animating force creatively for this novel? What was like the first thing? Was it an image or a phrase or a particular scene or a dynamic?
I think there was a couple things. I had become really interested in the clothes of that period and the undergarments. And then for some reason, you just start collecting things, you don't really understand why, but I was really fascinated by women when they wore their crinolines, which is those hoop things. And so I was looking at different images and photographs and drawings of women in these cages. And there was something that I found so appealing about that they were sort of walking around in these metaphors, and just how dangerous they were. Like when the women in my book, those crinolines are always trying to destroy them, knock them downstairs, or when they try and go to the bathroom, it just tips over, because I felt that was that was kind of lacking in Victorian novels of the time, just the absurdity of dressing like that, and how, women were always being catching on fire because the dresses were too big to control, and they had no sense of where they were. So that was one of the things. And I had written a scene that I had put aside that took place in a brothel at that time. And I was just sort of fascinated because I had been reading about sex workers at the time and the sort of conditions they lived in, and whether or not they had agency, because they actually had better life expectancies and health than other women at that time, especially mothers. Mothers had it the worst all through history. But so I was curious about that, and just the different types of women who would be in a brothel at that time. So, and I had really, usually like if I have a scene that I really like, and there was something that I really quite liked about that description. So I wanted to kind of create this Victorian underworld that that was one that I hadn't quite seen before, that had more of an edge and just beauty to it, with like an incredibly violent world, but just with that feminine, like how femininity survives in that world and how it interacts with that world.
Yes, yeah. Actually, that I was going to ask you this question a little bit later, but that brings me to a question that I had about femininity. Is the Hollywood or the mainstream notion of a feminist narrative is just to cast women in the violent roles that were once only meant for men, ass kicking like women agents and spies or superheroes. And that's, it's a little bit more of a binary there, but how your work is so different. I wonder how you approach centering women and giving them their own unique power.
How did I approach it? Well, I wanted it to, I wanted to find within femininity all the agency, and to locate like ambition in it, to locate violence in it, locate like hatred and love, but not to turn and to see, because femininity is always presented as something so passive, and then when a woman moves towards more active character, they become more masculine. But I wanted them to remain feminine, to show that being a woman is not a passive act. It's only, we're told over and over again that those impulses are meant to kind of keep us at home, whereas those, for me, they underlie such an enormous like intellectual potential and such a like incredible drive to examine the world within it. So and that was one of the very initial things. I think even before I started writing the book, I wanted to have a book that centered women.
Yeah.
And then, and because it's a Victorian era, everything at the time was focused on finding a husband and getting married. So I wanted all these women who just didn't take that option, like none of them decide to become mothers or wives, because they know inherently within the society, it just won't let them pursue their goals. So these were, they were just, and also I just wanted to see where that would go. Like how could you, what a narrative would look like without any romance or men, and would it be? So, but it's just equally sexual and passionate.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's probably my most perverse book yet, but I can never tell.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it would depend on what reader you ask. Mm-hmm. But I delighted in it. And there are some moments where I can feel the characters choosing, and it's like, it's very exciting. It's very exciting that they're choosing something else, even though there are clearly very marked roads that we're supposed to travel as women. That they're sort of refusing, and that was really exciting. And they're very complex, and I loved that portrait of femininity as powerful but complicated and pointy, and just, it was really exciting. For those of you who are interested, please do drop a question and we'll get to your questions towards the end of the conversation. So I'm going to ask a question about fairy tale, because I think that there are fairy tale-like qualities in the novel. To me, the most exciting is just that sense of wonder and whimsy that's conveyed through the charged language, but it's also there in the qualities of Marie and Sadie, and it's there in certain twists and turns of the plot. I'm just curious, how does this infusion of fairy tale energy animate your writing, if you think that it does?
I mean, I love fairy tales, of course, and I love the sort of female, the girl heroine, that plucky girl heroine in fairy tales. I always loved. And then once I was reading some research about fairy tales, and then it always seemed to me that, because I was curious why there were more little girls in fairy tales than little boys, but then historically, when they first began, there was an equal amount of girls and boys. But it was like, because there's been so little literature for women throughout the times, and so just girls were going back to fairy tales, and it became the ones with the female heroines became the ones they became really attached to. So, and I love that thing where there's something always irreverent about a lot of the girls, and they're always breaking rules, and they're, yeah, I guess the word is plucky. They just go through these like bizarre adventures without any sort of parental figures around them.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I loved how women kind of, and young girls, and kind of save those figures throughout history, and kind of use them to communicate also sexuality. There's such an undercurrent of sex in so many of those fairy tales, particularly the ones that feature girls. So I wanted both that tension, the tension of little girls who are dangerous and just have that drive for adventure and confront people, and to have that their sexuality just always be charging, because they're at the beginning of the book, they're coming of age, and then it goes through when they're an adult woman. But I just wanted because sexuality when you're a girl is so strange at that age, and it's just growing through your whole body and you don't even know what it is. So I wanted that sort of magnetism to be throughout the book and the text.
Oh yeah, and it definitely is. Yeah, it's so weird, isn't it, about girls and fairy tales? It's true. There are lots of boys in fairy tales. We just don't read those anymore. Like we're not, they just have fallen away. Yeah, but there is something about that like clever girl of fairy tale. She always like gets through. It's
And I always like the way like they talk to adults, like the wolf, or they'll talk this sort of dry humor, and that always appealed to me.
Yeah, they're funny. Even when they're like they're most scary and violent, they're still kind of funny, and the girl is still like making her way through.
Yeah.
It's such a strange thing. It's I love that figure of fairy tale as well. Just thinking about that, and thinking about sort of the book's relationship to other kinds of literature, and also just to history. I wanted to ask a question about research. How did you approach researching this novel? And are there any did you go down some rabbit holes? And are there any historical discoveries you made that were amazing and irresistible, but in the end you didn't use them?
Oh, that I didn't use?
And stuff like stuff that was exciting and like inspiring too.
I think I just always end up finding a place for it. But that's the thing about researching. It's like, it's just selective. You're just looking for whatever, you're just going through that time period and looking for little elements that fit into your aesthetic. And then when you find the details, you're just so excited, because then like there's one part with little automatons, and like when I was looking at them, it was so magical, like what they were doing in the time with those figures. And so I had put that in, and even like the theater and the type of like those dance halls that they went to, and what they were like, and the type of performances they had. So I was researching the dance halls, and there were so many different performances I wanted to put in. I was like, oh no, I can only like choose one or two. But there was, like girls who came out and like just had like 6 legs, but they did, we have people under the dress, and then all the animals, and it's so kind of, it was just an interesting time period. Everyone was so curious at that time, because the division between what was magical and what was real was suddenly being questioned in a strange way. Like they were having light bulbs and sound coming out. So anything that had previously seemed like godlike and impossible was suddenly impossible. So I think actually one of the things I didn't put in was their interest in spiritualism and ghosts, which I always love, but there was no place for it, because at one point I was like, oh, I want to have this scene with these girls who are like at a Ouija board, and they like all of a sudden all these other little girl ghosts come out. But so that was a scene that remained sort of in my head and in the draft, because there's only so many little crazy girls I could fit into this novel, a novel of maniacal children.
You got to write a story like tribute to that, because that's a great scene idea. Did you research first, or did you kind of go back and forth between the writing and the research? Do you do both at the same time? How do you approach it?
I go back, let me think. I go back and forth, because usually like what I do is I sketch out the world.
Right.
Because, you know, it's historical fiction, but it's really your imagination just thrown onto that time. So it has to be a world that's more attuned to your own sensibilities, as opposed to some historical realism. I mean, other writers obviously do it differently, but not this one. But I don't. So it was sort of at the beginning, I started building it from my own imagination in my peculiar sense of what the Victorian world looked like, that I had kind of built up in my head from reading. I mean, I was a huge fan of Victorian novels. And so, I'm always like, well, let's just create it. And then you go into research to kind of give it more verisimilitude and just find different things. And it depends on the time period. Like some I do more research. I don't know. But I just had this wealth of knowledge. But then one of the things too, because it's interesting because it's 2 time periods. So I had to research the Victorian era for its sensibilities and all that. But then at the same time, I was researching French Revolutionary characters for details. And then I was like, oh my God, I have to, because Sadie was based a lot on the Marquis de Sade.
Course,
And so then I was like, oh my God, I have to go back into the world of the Marquis de Sade and looking at his biography. And he's such a revolting man that you kind of have to go through it and all. But then there was some details that were really interesting. Even his bisexuality, because then Sadie just also kind of embodies that. She's just will have sex with anybody. That's what, I don't think she's of any particular orientation. She just sees sex as a performative act from which she draws like inspiration for stories. But and actually one of the books too that oddly influenced my wanting to write this was Angela Carter's The Sadian Woman.
Oh, I haven't read that. I should.
Oh my God, you'll go nuts, Mona. It's like, because she takes Angela Carter, for those who don't know, she used to write a lot of fairy tales, and she kind of started that was one of the first person to really be like she wrote The Bloody Chamber, which just reimagines all these fairy tales in a feminist context. So she wrote a book about the Marquis de Sade, and like she counterintuitively located him as a feminist writer, or had some ideals that are similar, because the Marquis de Sade doesn't, he saw the virtuous woman, the woman who wanted to have a child, as grotesque, and he didn't see the female body as a host for children. He saw it just, so he wanted women in his text to be as perverted and as men. So Angela Carter, it's a brilliant essay, because I love when women just go and they just establish something wildly counterintuitive, and because from a female perspective, it's going to be radically different. So she looks at the Marquis de Sade as this man who saw women as in a different kind of light than of the time. And then it's so interesting, because at the same time, then you're reading then when you go back to his biography, he's someone who, raped women, kidnapped people, aristocratic excess. This is because of men like him. We had the French Revolution to begin with. And and I like the way, and I had really liked the way the Marquis de Sade had interacted within the French Revolution, where they liked him as a writer and an orator, but even everyone was like, he's uncontrollable. And I felt that was similar to Sadie. She's sort of part of the revolution, but then everybody is like, is she actually like, or she just here for kicks?
Oh,
yeah, she's a writer, so she's always going to be a bit outside everything.
yes.
The trouble with writers, they're just always around for kicks and you can't trust them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that speaks to a question that I'm going to ask later, but I don't want to ask it right now because I feel like if I asked it right now, it would give something away. So I'm not going to ask it right now. But yeah, Sadie is. I love Sadie so much. I want to ask about Montreal. This is your story space, so I'm curious. How does Montreal lend itself to storytelling and to this particular story especially?
I don't know. I think because I always kind of liked that it was an island. And I think as a kid, there was a sense of, I always felt like I was trapped on this island. And it seemed this island of where wonderful things happen, but it was also this island where I was trapped by my father, who was this terrible ogre and forced me to live with him, and somehow he had captured me and I lived in this little apartment. So there was always I kind of have that because it's the place where I experienced childhood. And also I just feel like I have a lot of creative license with Montreal. So I was writing all this stuff about Boston, say, and then I switched some streets around, people like, what are you talking about? You know nothing about Boston. And it's like, well, I mean, nobody can really say that about Montreal. So if you're from a place, you can really like totally mess with its mythologies. You can subvert what people think of it. So I guess I just feel like I have a sort of freedom in that way when I talk about Montreal. And Montreal in each book has it's become this more and more fabled, strange island that has less and less to do with the real Montreal.
Yeah, but I love it. It's like this like mythical Montreal. It's fantastic. Having grown up in Montreal too. Yeah, I did so much imagining that had a lot to do with it being an island. You're right. There's something about it being an island.
And it's because it was a port city, it just had so many like stories and craziness and so much, so many immigrants passed through Montreal, and it has I always found because there were so many Jewish immigrants, it has that very Yiddish storytelling feel. That's really wound up in the city, and it's also, I mean, largely French. So there's that French Catholicism, which makes it this kind of lends itself more to magical realism than anyone else in the country. So even when you read texts from Canada, the ones coming from Quebec are always stranger. Like I read one about this girl and she just grows hair all over her body and she's this little beast and the mother's always trying to shave it. But that's something that was just like, it's so Quebec because it's like that from that French kind of storytelling tradition.
Yeah, I love that too. It's true. It does give a kind of license. So speaking of license, I'm thinking about how reading and writing are so central to the book. Sadie and another character named George both find a kind of salvation in writing, and their work opens doors and takes them places. And I feel like writing definitely has done that for you. Do you feel like writing sometimes feels like your salvation? And if so, when did you come to believe that it could be that for you?
I think that I started writing like in journals, like really young. And I think at that point it was intuitive. I just didn't know why I was doing it. I was just so attracted to books, and it just offered me so much more than the world around me, and like different possibilities and different origin stories. Like I was always imagining a different origin story that I'd come from this book, and I was somehow that escaped from the book and was living in that apartment with my crazy father. But then I would read these books and I was like, oh, this is the book I belong in, this world with these people. These are my people. Wow. And but then writing, I think that like I have always, like the way I describe always Sadie writing, and it's always there's some magical thing when she writes, it just turns into ribbons untying and forests of twines. But I was always just magically drawn to that activity of writing longhand. And I still write longhand just because I just love that action. I find curse, like the words coming out. So I can never get over it. It's like, here you go, my ideas, there they are. But I think as I got in my early, probably around like 20 or 21, then I realized that somehow I was just going to invest everything into these words and see where they took me, and maybe it would save me from myself or whatever. I would die trying.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of felt in a very similarly.
Yeah.
I'm amazed though that you continue to write. So you transcribe it then, like eventually.
Yeah, then I transcribe it and then I do all the editing on the computer. Yeah.
I love that. I love doing that. I haven't done that in a long time, but that kind of inspires me to try it again, because I feel like the editing that happens between the longhand draft and the computer is kind of magical, actually. It can be. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about sugar. Sugar is such a poetically loaded subject. How did you decide that sugar was going to be the source of the Antoine family riches, and were there other industries that you considered? This is a little bit more inside the book, but I'm very curious.
That was one actually, because I was deciding what kind of factory they would own, and then when I was like, oh my God, obviously it's a sugar factory, obviously, because there's so much about cake and the sweetness, and Mary's she starts off as the most kind of sweet child in this almost absurd performance of what a little Victorian girl should be. And it's almost like whenever somebody is so good at something, you just feel like she kind of transcends it, and there's always like an element of tongue in cheek, like when she acts like a little Victorian girl. So she's associated with sugar, and just that she had, so it's the father's factory. So on all the bags that go throughout the city, when she's a little, her face is on it. So that was, so she was associated with sweetness, and she was put out in the world. So everyone kind of adored her at that point. But then through the book, she becomes kind of this monster. And then I kind of was interested too and I was like all the sort of, like she becomes really this horrible factory owner who oppresses everybody. And then within the sugar, I was also the sort of colonial history of the sugar factory is kind of deep within that, and the whole guilt of Marie and of the upper class and where it all comes from. And even if you look, I mean, it's far back, the novel looks at the factory girls who are working at the sugar factory and keep losing their fingers. But if you look way back in the history of sugar, then it's just even worse. So it's kind of, this poison is ingrained in the life of Marie Antoine, and there's really no way she can sort of eventually get out of her reckoning from her social class.
Yeah, I love that. And there is something there too, with sugar sort of embodying that balance that's in the style of the book itself, and in your voice too. It's like that kind of childish delight, but then also this darkness, the shadowiness, this razor sharpness. It's such a great balance.
And I like the excess of it too, because there were so many manuals about how to eat at the time too, and you just needed to never show anybody what you were eating. And I was reading this one guidebook to manners, and they were like, whatever you do, don't steal the food and put it in your pocket. I know some women get really hungry and they don't want to see people eating them, so they hide cookies all over their body and take them out. But if you get caught doing this, you'll never survive in society. So I just wanted these girls who were consume stuff, and just they were they're so lustful for life, and they were just taking this bite out of life. So I like the whole presence of cake, and you always just see Marie stuffing her mouth whenever she can.
Oh, it's great. Okay, I'll ask one more question, and then I'm going to ask you to read one last little
Okay.
bit before we go into questions. So I'll just ask this last one just because I'm very curious. So the poem "The Goblin Market" plays a role in the book. I love that poem. What's your connection to it? And how do I'll try not to give too much away, but why? What about it allowed it to sort of be so important for these two girls and their performance of reading it?
Yeah, I was, well, when I was, that poem actually came early on in the writing. So like I chose it because I wanted them to have an elocution contest.
Yes.
And that's one of those things, like as a writer, I've always wanted this scene. Like I remember as a child, I was obsessed with Anne of Green Gables, and I liked that she had this performance of the highwayman in it. So I was like, at some point I want an elocution contest. And then I wanted it to be, and I was like, what poem do I like of that time? And I was like, oh, it has to be by a woman. And I was like, oh my God, Goblin Market, of course. And then I went, and I hadn't read Goblin Market in years. And then I read it, and it was so like perverted and wild. And this adventure these girls go on, and they go into this wood, and they meet these goblins, and just they have this like crazy, it's like they're having orgasms when they're eating the fruit. And so that, even reading that, it immediately kind of started influencing more of the text. And so the text started like, once the text knew about that poem, it just incorporated it, and a lot of the actions start reflecting the girls in that poem who go to a dark place and sort of try and come out of it.
Yeah, I love the relationship between the poem and the story. It's so great. So will you give us like just another little reading before we move on to Q&A?
Yeah, so this part is just, there ends up being, this revolution starts up with the working class girls in Montreal starts concocting itself, coming together. So this is just a little scene of what it's like for men now to walk down the street, that they're terrified of girls. And one of the things girls have started doing is wearing these little black executioner masks. Young girls wore their masks even when they weren't going to a manifestation. They found them fun to wear in games of tag. Everything was more fun with their masks on. They were able to be small monsters. With the mask on, it was impossible to be evaluated as ugly or good looking. They were freed from judgment and freed from authority. The masks were a small barrier that protected the girls from men. Men looked at them, but there was no way to read them. They were hidden behind their masks. Men felt as though they were being stared at when they passed by the girls. They looked away, and they still felt themselves being sized up and stared at behind their backs. They felt the eyes upon them all day. They didn't understand how this was permissible. Why didn't their mothers take the hoods off their heads so they could go back to being little girls? A man was walking home from work when he passed 3 girls with masks on. One of the girls tossed a handful of jacks onto the sidewalk. They looked like a cluster of spiders running over his shoes. He hurried on. He had the distinct impression the girls were following him. He thought that at any minute they would take their hairpins out and run after him with them. They would stab him, or perhaps they would just insult him. He didn't know which was worse. He wished he hadn't taken such a dark side road home. He should have gone to Sherbrooke Street, which was well lit and populated. His feeling of unease did not abate when he was in his room and the door was locked. He felt like weeping with frustration because he wasn't sure whether he was afraid of the girls for no reason or if they had been genuinely threatening. That unknowing in itself was what made him feel so powerless. He didn't really have control over the situation. He went to put a kettle on, but then dropped it, startled. There was a thin girl with a beige mask on her head standing in the corner of the room. But after he blinked several times, he saw it was just the lamp, of course. Every time he blinked, familiar objects turned into treacherous girls.
Love it. So good.
Thank you both thank you, Heather, for reading those selections, and thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. We do have some questions. I do want to use some of the questions people asked. I think were answered in the flow of the conversation, but I I kind of want to sum up those questions as well, in case you want to say anything more on the topic. A couple people wrote about Montreal. Sean wrote that I've never been there, but after reading two of your novels, it feels like a living being to me. And Jessica wrote, Heather, you've repeatedly used Montreal as a setting for your novels, but Mona, you've used different settings for yours. I'm wondering what compels both of you in your setting choices. So if you want to return to that thread, I just wanted to make sure that those audience members were heard. But I'll read the first question we received, and apologies if these may get into a bit more granularity of questions that perhaps were already asked. But Sarah writes, I read Lonely Hearts Hotel years ago and listened to the audiobook last week, a fun prep before your new book. The narration was exquisite, just perfect. I'm wondering how involved you are in the process of selecting a narrator for your novels.
I don't know. Mona can answer this one too. I just they will just give me a list of different readers, and then you listen to them, and then you select the one you imagine would be the best.
Yep.
Yeah. Is that how it works for you, Mona?
Yep. I got a list of I think it was 3. And yeah, I got lucky and found a good narrator, and you did too. Sounds like, yeah.
Yeah, but it's funny because right away.
Yeah.
So it's so easy because you're like, oh no. Oh
yeah.
no.
Yeah. How do you figure it out? I don't know. It is instinctive, isn't it? You could just hear it.
I think it's for myself. I wonder if I don't choose people who sound slightly like me.
Yeah.
Do you do that?
I think so. I'm thinking to some degree about the narrator, and
yeah.
Does that voice have the ability to encompass the emotional tones of that world?
Yeah.
And you can tell right away, right?
Yeah. For me, I always look for something a little wry.
Yes.
I like they've always been women voices so far because main characters always are, but I like the sound, like when a woman's voice kind of seems like they're about to burst out laughing, like they have that kind of an ironic undertone. And I'm like, okay, they'll be able to deliver the jokes because I have a lot of humor in my work. So some of the voices are too serious for me. So I need something a little sneaky.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. You need some wryness. It's always good. A little bit of irony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will just make a shameless plug here. If there are any viewers who are audiobook fans, you can purchase audiobooks and still support Literati by using a service called Libro.fm, and you can select Literati as your bookstore of choice. I think you also in that service get a free audiobook a month as well. Sarah asks if When We Lost Our Heads was a dollhouse like the one behind you, what would it look like? What rooms would be inside?
If When We Lost Our Heads was a dollhouse?
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because dollhouses were a big influence on, because I love dollhouses, obviously. That one I actually gave to my friends' children, and they had outgrown them, and I came over and they had turned it into a crack house and stuff, and I got police cars. So I was like, I guess you guys have outgrown this, because the next time I come over, you're gonna blow it up, as children do. I mean, that's what you do with your toys. It's like your dolls you eventually start destroying, or making them go on, putting them in the river, just I don't know what, see if they'll eventually come to life to save themselves. Right. But anyways, I love that. I mean, dollhouses are so Victorian. So it depends, because if it was, the two kind of structures that I saw really well were Marie's house, because it has so many different rooms and they build it to entertain, and they were such spectacles to bring people in at that time of the upper class. And then the brothel, which was like a large house with different rooms, and it had been built, and it was the only kind of structure in the Squalid Mile that was kind of sturdy, because the madame who was well off had bought the best house in Squalid Mile. And so it's kind of, I liked creating the Victorian house that was all broken and they were like dirty, but at the same time you turn the lights off and they just do ambient lighting and it's splendid. So I don't know, one of those houses, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question. It was like an abstract, strange question. I did my best.
Thank you. The viewer writes, "Hi Heather, the titles of your chapters are a delight. Can you tell us more about your process when it comes to naming chapters?"
Oh, my chapter titles, like when the book is done, then I just have a list of my chapters and what each is in them. And then I just come up with different titles, and I actually do it so that when it's done, the chapter title, it reads like kind of like a poem, and it just seems appealing to me on the page because it occurred to me, I think it was my second novel that I was like, it's this opportunity, like it's just this little area where you can just have total fun and whimsy and naming the chapters.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool.
But do you name your chapters, Mona? No.
I don't. I mean, I guess I kind of did with 13 Ways, but they were stories.
Mhm.
So, I knew those. Yeah. With Bunny and All's Well, I did not. I get tempted to, but then I worry I'm going to like lose myself in it. I should try next time. Because it sounds like fun.
I think we just have one more question here. Barbara writes, no, we've got a couple more. We have time for a couple more. Barbara writes, to which character do you feel closest to in the novel?
I think I'm going to...
It's a hard one.
It's a hard one because I think emotionally, oddly enough, I feel most attached to Marie Antoine because I don't know, like she's the most corrupt, problematic one. But at the same time, when she hurts, like I just felt it. Like I felt Marie Antoine's, even though she's arguably the most villainous character in the book. When she hurt, I just felt it so much. And I understood a lot of how her evil or her manipulative kind of oppressive ways came from being hurt and lost. So I feel like most emotionally attached to Marie. But then at the same time, I'm the most dazzled by Sadie because Sadie's a writer. So Sadie's probably... There are so many things about writing and how I love writing that I put into Sadie. And which one did you like, Mona? Is that your Sadie character?
I loved Sadie, but I actually, when you talk about Marie, just what you were describing, that really comes through. And so I think I'm torn. I love them both. But yeah, I felt Marie's hurt, and when she was in danger, I felt very scared for her. So I feel like her full humanity comes through despite the actions that she takes in the book.
And it's kind of funny because when you have someone who's so self-assured and full of themselves, and like she's just unable to see what's going to happen, like nothing bad she feels can happen to her. So when bad things happen, they're harder than, say, like Mary Robespierre, like she's just been through hell. So it's like when things happen to her, and it's like, crazy, worse stuff happens to Mary Robespierre.
Oh yeah.
But she's such a little like hard ass little demon that she's just gonna, like, she doesn't care. Like, you see, and even the things she does, she's psychopathic, the things she's able to tolerate and put up with. Yeah. So you somehow which I don't know, maybe that's like a kind of a flaw in being human, where we kind of respond to people who are hurt when they're isolated from hurt, and the people who suffer all the time, we're like, oh, you're used to suffering. Yeah.
We're with her when she's just like a little kid, and she's so cute.
I know.
Like
it's so true, because those two, I really give them to you as children. So it's like, and they're the evil ones. So it's like everybody else is, like more moral, and they have like better things to do, like ideas and philosophically more sound reasons to do things. But Marie and Sadie, yeah, you knew them as children.
Yeah. So you're kind of just sucked in.
Yeah.
We've got one more question here. Heather, are you already working on your next novel? If so, what era are you writing about next?
I have started my next novel, and it's set in an unnamed country this time. It's just this strange, and it's sort of like, I would say the era is about 1942, and it's kind of set around like the Black Forest, but an imaginary Black Forest. Because I had gone to Germany and had gone through the forest there, and it just gave me these different ideas about Grimm. So who knows? But who knows? Might end up in the no. I think it won't end up in the trash. It's hard to say with novels. Sometimes they just die. Like, what happened? It's going so well.
It's a terrible thing. Why 1942? What draws you to that time?
It was there was I think it comes from a lot of times, a lot of the books that I write come from a period of time that I've loved the writing from.
Yeah.
And I love so much a lot of the writing that came out right after the Second World War. I mean, a lot of it had to do with the fact that in France, so many writers weren't allowed to publish during the occupation. So when it was over, there was just this all this crazy stuff. It's like, especially because when you're censored and when you're told what you're doing is illegal, it makes you crazier and more perverted and strange. So I really love the absurdism that came out right after the Second World and the existential questions. So yeah.
Oh, I love it. I'm so excited. I think it's not going to go in the trash. It's going to be.
What are you working on?
I am working on a novel that has a title. It's called Rouge, and it's in Montreal. Montreal is part of it, and it's about a girl who gets sucked into a really sinister beauty cult.
Oh, it's awesome. So good.
Fingers crossed.
Well, hopefully we can have you both in the physical bookstore to celebrate these next novels. You can purchase When We Lost Our Heads from Literati. There's the link in the chat. There's also a link in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. Heather ONeill, Mona Awad, thank you so much for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. I hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great night, all.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Take care.